Chapter 1. I spent 2 lives dying for men who owed me everything. So when the Alpha Kings publicly rejected me in front of 300 jaw-dropped nobles, I did not cry. I straightened my tunic, cleared my throat, and asked the Supreme Commander if the palace planned on refunding the catering deposit. The silence in the ceremonial hall hit harder than a physical blow. Nobles froze mid-gasp, holding silver goblets and jeweled fans like statues carved out of pure arrogance. Up on the marble dais, Caelan, Rhyse, and Oren, the identical triplet kings ruling the Veyrion Empire, stared down at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. Caelan, the eldest and army commander, smelled like heavy cedar smoke and sharpened steel. His golden eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching so hard I heard his teeth grind. Beside him, Rhyse, the High Magistrate, adjusted his silk cuffs with cold, deliberate precision, his scent of rain against ancient stone flooding the air. Oren, the charming diplomat who usually wore a smirk to mask his cruelty, stood totally still, his winter citrus sense souring into utter disbelief. Aster stood between them, small, frail, and wide-eyed, clutching Caelan's arm as if I might spring forward and bite. The original owner of this body, Nico, would have dropped to his knees right here. He would have begged, screamed, shed ocean-sized tears, and threatened to end his life to guilt these 3 alphas into claiming him. Nico spent years throwing tantrums, sabotaging rivals, and writing embarrassing poetry to earn a spot at their side. But Nico died the moment I woke up in his skin, carrying the bitter soul of Tavian Rook, a 26-year-old corporate accountant from Chicago who died of exhaustion in an office elevator 6 minutes after paying off his deadbeat family's debt. I knew the script. I had read the trashy Omegaverse novel during my double shifts. If I fought this rejection, I would end up accused of treason and executed in the palace square before winter. I was done working myself into an early grave for people who saw me as an unpaid servant. Caelan took a step forward, his boot clicking against the polished floorboards. He spoke with the deep, rumbling authority of a top-rank alpha accustomed to absolute obedience, expecting his words to crush my spirit into dust. He declared that their ancestral bond belonged to Aster, that my past actions proved I was unworthy of the crown mark, and that my family's historic claim on the royal lineage ended today. He waited for the breakdown. The entire room waited for the show. I checked my nails. I looked Caelan dead in the eye and told him that if the royal treasury was keeping the non-refundable deposit for the 6-tier berry cake, I expected at least 3 tiers sent directly to my carriage. A noblewoman in the front row dropped her crystal glass, shattering the tension into 100 loud pieces. Oren let out a strange, choked noise that sounded dangerously like a smothered laugh before Rhyse elbowed him in the ribs. Caelan's face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. He leaned over the dais and asked me if I took the sacred laws of the Empire for a joke. I pulled the gold-bound rejection contract from my inner pocket, uncapped my fountain pen, and signed my name with a flourish that left a tiny ink smudge on the sacred royal seal. I slid the paper across the polished marble floor with the tip of my boot, right to the edge of Aster's slipper. I told them that since our business was officially concluded, I would be taking my leave before anyone tried to bill me for the hall rental. I turned my back on 300 stunned aristocrats and walked toward the heavy oak doors. My rain-soaked jasmine scent, usually suppressed and weak under Nico's old desperate anxiety, flickered through the air like a cold, refreshing breeze after a summer heat wave. It was light, sharp, and entirely unbothered. Rhyse called out my name, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy weight of an alpha command that usually forced low-rank omegas to their knees in submission. He ordered me to halt and face the throne to receive my formal exile decree. The command hit the back of my neck like a heavy hand, but I just rolled my shoulders, stretched my neck until it popped, and kept walking. My body belonged to me now, not to their laws, not to their bloodlines, and certainly not to 3 men who thought a pretty title made them gods. I pushed the grand doors open, stepping out into the crisp evening air of the palace courtyard. The cool wind brushed against my face, carrying away the suffocating scent of royal incense and male ego. Down in the courtyard, my modest wooden carriage waited, looking tiny and absurd next to the gilded war coaches of the visiting dukes. My driver stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, holding his breath as if waiting for royal guards to tackle me to the cobblestones. I climbed into the carriage, pulled the velvet curtains shut, and slumped back against the cushioned seat. A deep, sudden burn ignited beneath my collarbone, right over the pale, unformed scar of the royal bond mark. It throbbed with a strange, golden pulse, sending a violent wave of heat straight to my heart. Chapter 2. The pain beneath my collarbone burned like a drop of liquid fire, but I refused to give it the satisfaction of a groan. I reached into my coat, unbuttoned the high silk shirt, and stared into the small glass hand mirror hanging from the carriage wall. The faint, silver outline of 3 interlocking crown rings, the royal mark that had remained dormant for 2 decades, was glowing a bright, angry gold. It pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, pushing a sharp, metallic taste to the back of my throat. In the novel, the bond mark was supposed to fade permanently the moment the rejection contract was signed. It was supposed to die, freeing the Omega to wither away in shame while the Alphas claimed their true mate. Instead, my mark felt alive, twisting deep into my nerves like fresh roots digging into dry soil. I slammed the mirror face down on the bench, buttoned my shirt to the top, and told the driver to step on it before the palace realized I was leaving with their pristine silver teapot tucked inside my cloak. We arrived at the lakeside palace just as the moon reached its peak over the dark waters. The estate was a sprawling, neglected disaster of gray stone, overgrown wild roses, and dust-covered windows located 3 miles away from the main royal court. The Imperial Council had assigned it to Nico years ago, assuming the damp air and isolation would break his pride. To me, it looked like absolute paradise. There were no royal accountants asking for budget reports, no nobles whispering behind embroidered sleeves, and most importantly, no triplet kings demanding emotional devotion. I kicked open the heavy front doors, ignoring the 5 palace guards who had been stationed there by the High Magistrate to monitor my movements. The head guard stepped forward, clearing his throat with rigid authority. He informed me that under the High Magistrate's explicit orders, my movements were restricted to the East Wing, and I was required to submit a daily written log of my activities for security assessment. I looked at him, looked at his 4 armed buddies, and asked him if the High Magistrate was paying their overtime out of his personal pocket or the state defense budget. The guard blinked, completely thrown off balance. I told him that since I was officially a private citizen without a royal title, his presence on my property constituted illegal trespass under Section 4 of the Civil Code. I informed them that if they were still standing on my porch in 3 minutes, I would hire the local fishermen to dump 3 tons of rotting lake carp into their barracks windows. They retreated to the outer gatehouse within 2 minutes flat. By midnight, I had dismissed 6 lazy servants who were being paid by the court to spy on me, locked the grand reception hall, and set up a temporary bedroom in the sunroom overlooking the water. I stripped off the uncomfortable formal dress clothes, threw them directly into the fireplace, and pulled on a loose, oversized cotton tunic. For the first time in 2 lives, nobody was asking me to pay a debt. Nobody was asking me to balance a ledger or beg for affection. I dragged a plush chaise lounge to the window, propped my feet up on a velvet stool, and closed my eyes to take the most legendary nap in the history of the Veyrion Empire. Sleep did not bring peace. The moment my consciousness drifted, my mind slammed into a blinding void filled with floating golden threads. Patterns of light crisscrossed through my vision, forming intricate, geometric structures that represented every physical and magical object within 3 miles. I saw the weak, crumbling stone in the palace foundation. I saw the hidden rusted iron gears inside the front gate lock. I saw the flow of energy moving through the atmosphere, sharp and clear. This was crown weaving, the legendary lost Omega ability described in the ancient histories. Nico had possessed it all along, but his obsessed, panic-filled mind had treated the constant visual noise as a terrifying mental disease. He had taken dangerous black market suppressants to shut it down, ruining his health and dulling his senses. To an accountant who spent his previous life analyzing complex financial spreadsheets, these golden patterns were not a curse. They were data. I traced a finger through the air, mentally snapping a fractured line inside the lake palace's broken heating system. A warm, Soothing rush of air instantly surged through the floor vents, filling the cold room with heat. I chuckled softly, resting my head back against the pillow. If the kings thought they had banished a broken, pathetic ex-fiancé to starve in the cold, they were in for a very boring disappointment. A heavy, metallic thud echoed from the front courtyard, shattering the quiet night. The sound of high-bred horses baying in anger cut through the fog, followed by the undeniable, heavy scent of cedar smoke blowing through the gaps in the window frame. I didn't even get up from my chair. I simply pulled the thick wool blanket over my shoulders and muttered to the empty room that if those idiots broke my front gate, I was billing the war ministry for the repairs. The front door burst open down the hall, heavy boots marching directly toward the sunroom with terrifying speed. Caelan stood in the doorway, drenched in midnight rain, his eyes blazing like molten gold in the dark. Chapter 3. Caelan stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim light from the corridor, his wet cloak dripping water onto my clean wooden floorboards. He smelled like a forest fire mixed with raw aggression, his alpha presence radiating outward in thick, suffocating waves that would have forced any ordinary Omega to their knees in sheer panic. He gripped the handle of his broadsword, his knuckles white, his chest heaving as if he had ridden his horse at a breakneck gallop all the way from the capital. He demanded to know what kind of black magic I had used on the rejection contract, his voice deep and rough, vibrating through the small sunroom like low thunder. I didn't move an inch. I stayed wrapped in my wool blanket, rested my cheek against the velvet pillow, and asked him if his mother had ever taught him to wipe his boots before stepping on hand-woven rugs. Caelan froze. The heavy, intimidating aura surrounding him flickered for a fraction of a second, caught completely off guard by my utter lack of fear. He took a slow, menacing step toward my lounge, pulling a rolled parchment from his belt and slamming it down on the small tea table beside my head. It was the rejection contract I had signed hours ago. The ink where my name rested was glowing with a fierce, neon gold light, and the royal wax seal had melted into the shape of 3 intertwined vines. He leaned down, placing both hands on the arms of my chair, trapping me beneath his massive frame. His gold eyes searched my face, looking for the desperate, scheming Nico he had known for 5 years. He growled out that the contract refused to settle in the Imperial Archives. He said the royal magic had rejected the cancellation of our bond, locking the Supreme Court doors and throwing the entire legal ministry into absolute chaos. He accused me of hiding an ancient dark ritual up my sleeve, using my signet ring to tamper with the Empire's sacred blood laws just to force my way back into his life. I pulled my arms out from under the blanket, reached past his face, and grabbed a cold plum from the fruit basket on the table. I took a loud, crunchy bite, chewed slowly, and swallowed before telling him that his legal ministry was clearly run by incompetent hacks who couldn't read a standard contractual clause if it bit them on the nose. I pointed out that Section 3 of the Imperial Bond Law clearly stated that a rejection required the unanimous physical presence of all 3 claim holders at the time of signing. He had signed it. His brothers hadn't. They were too busy holding Aster's hands on the dais to put pen to paper. Caelan stared at me, his mouth opening slightly as he processed the dull, administrative reality of my words. He had come here expecting a villainous confession, a hysterical declaration of unrequited love, or a dangerous threat to the throne. Instead, he was getting a lecture on contract syntax from a guy eating a fruit in his nightclothes. His heavy cedar scent shifted, losing its sharp, aggressive edge and softening into something strange, confused, and deeply restless. His eyes drifted down to my neck, locking onto the faint golden glow peeking through the unbuttoned collar of my tunic. Before he could speak, the soft rustle of silk sounded from the doorway. Rhyse stepped into the room, impeccably dressed despite the late hour, holding an open leather ledger in his gloved hands. Behind him came Oren, his silver hair slightly damp from the rain, a strange, unreadable expression playing across his sharp features. Rhyse looked at his brother, then looked at me lounging on the chair, and stated calmly that the legal archives had indeed confirmed my assessment. The bond remained active because he and Oren had failed to add their signatures before the document was removed from the hall. Oren leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest, his winter citrus scent filling the damp air with a sharp, crisp warmth. He looked at the half-eaten plum in my hand, then at the comfortable setup in the sunroom, and chuckled softly. He observed that I didn't look like an Omega mourning the loss of his grand royal wedding. He noted that I looked more like a retired magistrate enjoying a very long vacation. I sat up, swinging my legs over the side of the lounge, and looked at all three of them. I told them that if they wanted their signatures on the paper so badly, they could sit down right now, sign the damn thing, and let me go back to sleep. I pushed the glowing parchment toward Rhyse, offering him my ink pen with a bright, sarcastic smile. Rhyse didn't take the pen. He stepped closer, his icy blue eyes fixing on mine with a quiet, intense scrutiny that felt like a blade scanning for a weakness. He noted that the old Nico would have burned the contract before letting any of them touch it. He asked me where the real Nico had gone, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low whisper that sent a cold shiver straight down my spine. I held his gaze, unblinking, and told him that the old Nico had died of a broken heart the moment they chose someone else, leaving behind only a guy who valued 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep over 3 arrogant kings. I stood up, walked right past Caelan's broad frame, and opened the large glass door leading to the lakeside balcony. The cold night air rushed in, swirling around us, blowing my rain-soaked jasmine scent directly into their faces. I pointed out into the dark night and politely requested that they take their horse parade off my lawn before I filed an official noise complaint with the city council. Oren stepped up to the doorway, stopping just inches from me. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over my bare collarbone, his pulse racing so fast I could hear it over the sound of the lake waves. He whispered that my scent had changed. It no longer smelled like the cheap, heavy perfumes Nico used to wear to attract their attention. It smelled like wild storms and clean mountain air. He admitted, with a strange, dark glimmer in his eyes, that he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to sign the paper anymore. Chapter 4. Oren's words hung in the cold night air like a threat, thick with an unspoken tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't flinch. I reached out, grabbed his wrist before his fingers could touch my bare skin, and pushed his hand away with enough force to turn his face serious. I told him that if he touched me without a written permit, I would sue the royal house for physical harassment and demand 50% of his personal estate as emotional compensation. Oren blinked, his jaw dropping slightly before a genuine, loud laugh burst from his throat. A sound so rare and unfamiliar in the formal royal court that even Caelan turned to stare at him in shock. Rhyse moved between us, his cold demeanor snapping back into place like a steel trap. He reached down to the table, picked up the glowing rejection contract, and held it near the oil lamp. The moment his gloved fingers brushed the golden parchment, the crown-weaving power deep inside my mind snapped awake without my permission. My vision flashed with bright gold light, stripping away the physical surface of the world around me. The air turned into a visual sea of glowing geometric threads, revealing the hidden structural bonds connecting every person and object in the room. I saw the ancient magical lines binding the 3 kings together, a massive, intertwined braid of red and silver energy that pulsed with incredible force. But when my eyes landed on the contract in Rhyse's hand, my heart stopped cold. The golden light surrounding the document wasn't flowing from the royal seal. It was bleeding out from my own soul, reacting violently to a dark, jagged web of black corruption that was wrapped tightly around the triplets' heads like a crown of thorns. I stepped forward before I could stop myself, my hand reaching out and snatching the 3 rejected ceremonial mating rings that sat in a velvet box beside the paper. The instant my bare skin touched the cold gold of the rings, a violent memory burst inside my brain like a bomb exploding. The sunroom vanished. I was no longer standing in the lakeside palace. I was standing in a sunny, sun-drenched garden 15 years ago. I saw 3 young boys, a bruised, fiery young Caelan, a quiet, studious Rhyse, and a bright, laughing Oren, sitting beneath an ancient oak tree. And sitting right in the middle of them, holding a small wooden sword and laughing till his cheeks turned red, was a young boy with dark eyes and my exact face. Young Caelan was promising to build a grand palace just for him. Young Rhyse was carefully wrapping a silk bandage around the boy's scratched knee. Young Oren was fast asleep with his head resting comfortably in the boy's lap. They weren't just childhood acquaintances. They were inseparable. They were bonded from the moment they could walk. Then the golden memory fractured into 1,000 sharp pieces of glass. A dark, hooded figure stepped out from the shadows of the garden, holding a silver needle that glowed with a terrifying, sickly purple light. I watched in absolute horror as the figure reached into the minds of the sleeping boys, slowly pulling out every single thread of light that contained the dark-eyed boy's face. The figure didn't erase the memories completely. They carefully spliced a new face over the hollow spaces. A small, pale boy with soft blue eyes and a quiet, delicate smile. Esther. The hooded figure turned slightly, revealing a flash of an icy silver signet ring engraved with a coiled serpent surrounding an hourglass. The royal archivist. Morkant. The memory shattered, slamming me back into my body with the force of a runaway freight train. I stumbled backward, my knees giving out, my breath catching in my throat as cold sweat poured down my spine. The 3 rings clattered against the floorboards, rolling across the wood until they bumped against Caelan's leather boots. The sudden, overwhelming surge of raw emotion, grief, betrayal, and a deep, agonizing loss that had never belonged to me, flooded my chest, forcing a ragged gasp from my lips. Caelan dropped to his knees in an instant, his heavy hands reaching out to catch my shoulders before my head hit the floor. His cedar smoke scent flared up, thick and wildly protective, instantly wrapping around me like a warm wall. He called out my name, his voice laced with a raw, panicked urgency that cut straight through the cold air. Rhyse dropped his ledger, his icy composure completely breaking as he knelt on my other side, his cold fingers reaching out to check my frantic pulse. Oren hovered right above us, his eyes wide with a terrifying, wild desperation as his winter citrus scent filled every corner of the room. I lay there, staring up at the 3 identical faces that had been systematically stolen, rewritten, and manipulated by a monster living inside their own castle. The original Nico hadn't been a crazy, jealous villain who randomly attacked Aster out of nowhere. He had spent his entire life watching the 3 boys who had loved him suddenly look at him with complete disgust and cold unfamiliarity. He had spent years desperately trying to make them remember the promises they had made under the oak tree, slowly losing his sanity as everyone called him a lunatic. He wasn't a monster. He was a victim who had died completely alone in the dark. I pulled myself away from Caelan's grip, my breathing rough and uneven as I pushed myself up against the leg of the table. My rain-soaked jasmine scent flared with a bitter, dangerous sharp edge that made all 3 alphas freeze in place. I looked at Caelan, then at Rhyse, and finally at Oren. The dark comedy of my new life vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold, sharp rage that burned hotter than any corporate deadline I had ever faced. I could give them back their memories right now using my crown weaving. I could break Morkant's spell and restore the truth. But to undo a memory spell that deep, my power would have to consume 3 of my own personal memories from my past life in exchange. My memories of my real mother, my old home, and my quiet life before this nightmare. I looked at the 3 kings kneeling on my dusty floor, and I made my choice. Chapter 5. I pulled my knees up to my chest, wrapped my arms around myself, and stared at the 3 kings kneeling on my floor like defeated soldiers. Caelan reached out a hand, his fingers hovering inches from my arm, his golden eyes filled with an intense, desperate confusion that made him look human for the first time since I had met him. He asked me what I had just seen, his voice low and gravelly, carrying a strange tremor that he couldn't mask with his alpha authority. He admitted that the moment I touched those rings, a sudden, blinding migraine had ripped through his skull, bringing with it a phantom image of a little boy laughing beneath an oak tree. I leaned back against the table leg, looked him dead in the eye, and told him that if he wanted a medical diagnosis, he should schedule an appointment with the court doctor during regular business hours. I was not going to play their tragic savior. I was not going to trade my precious memories of my old life, the only real things I had left, to fix a mess created by their own naive trust in a traitorous archivist. If these 3 men wanted their past back, they were going to have to suffer for it. They were going to have to figure it out on their own, piece by painful piece, while I sat back and watched them realize what they had thrown away. Rhyse stood up slowly, smoothing down his dark coat, his icy blue eyes narrowing as he analyzed every inch of my face. He noted that my heart rate had spiked to a dangerous level, yet my physical expression remained entirely blank and unreadable. He stated that I was hiding something massive, something that involved the royal lineage, the rejected bond, and the mysterious illness that had been affecting Aster for the past 3 years. He stepped toward the window, looking out over the dark lake, and revealed that Aster had been suffering from violent memory lapses every time he entered the royal archives. I picked up the 3 mating rings from the floor, tossed them casually into the air, and caught them in my palm. I told Rhyse that if he spent less time investigating his ex-fiancée and more time auditing the Imperial Archive budget, he might actually discover why the western provinces were currently starving. Both Rhyse and Caelan went dead silent. Oren's head snapped toward me, his playful demeanor completely vanishing into a sharp, lethal focus. Oren asked me how I knew about the western province deficit, his voice dropping into a cold, dangerous whisper. That information was classified as a top-tier state secret, restricted strictly to the royal cabinet and the High Magistrate's inner circle. Not even the Prime Minister, Nico's father, had been granted access to those financial reports. I let out a soft, exasperated sigh, stood up from the floor, and brushed the dust off my cotton tunic. I walked over to my desk, picked up a stack of old, crumpled catering invoices from the royal wedding prep, and tossed them straight onto Caelan's chest. I told them that any idiot with basic 3rd-grade math skills could look at those food supply orders and see that half the grain meant for the western farms was being redirected to private warehouses in the capital under Morkan's personal seal. Nico had discovered the exact same thing 3 months ago, but when he tried to bring the documents to the court, Rhyse had ordered the guards to throw him out for spreading malicious rumors. Caelan grabbed the invoices, his eyes flying across the scribbled numbers and official stamps. His breathing turned heavy and ragged as the dull, administrative reality of my words slammed into his brain. He had called Nico a jealous, scheming snake who was trying to ruin Aster's reputation. He had threatened to lock Nico in the dungeon for daring to question the royal archivist's integrity. And all the while, Nico had been holding physical proof of high treason that could save thousands of starving civilians. Rhyse moved to Caelan's side, staring at the papers with a pale, horrified expression that shattered his cold magistrate facade. He realized, with absolute clarity, that the court had executed 3 innocent low-rank clerks last month based on forged evidence provided by Morkan, evidence that Nico had begged him to double-check. Oren stepped up to me, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out and gently grabbed my wrist. He didn't try to pull me close, nor did he use his alpha dominance to force a response. He just held me, his winter citrus scent thick with an overwhelming, suffocating guilt that filled the entire room. He asked me why Nico hadn't told them the whole truth, why he had let them hate him for 5 long years without fighting back. I pulled my wrist out of his grip, my expression colder than the lake wind blowing through the open balcony door. I told him that Nico had tried every single day until his heart simply gave up under the weight of their disgust. I looked at all 3 of them, the powerful, untouchable triplet kings of Asterwin, and told them that they didn't deserve a tragic hero. They deserved the truth, and the truth was that they were 3 blind fools who had sacrificed the only person who had ever truly loved them for a manufactured lie. A heavy horn echoed from the main road outside the estate, cutting through the heavy silence. The sound of rapid, heavy horse hooves pounded against the cobblestones, accompanied by the bright red glow of emergency torches flashing through the trees. A royal courier burst through the outer gate, shouting at the top of his lungs that High Steward Mailer and Archivist Morkan had just placed the entire capital city under martial law, claiming that the Triplet Kings had been compromised by a dark Omega curse. Caelan drew his broadsword with a sharp metallic hiss, his eyes blazing with fury. He turned to me, his voice raw and desperate, asking me to return to the capital under his personal protection. I smiled, stepped back toward the balcony, and told him I was taking the night off. Chapter 6. Caelan lunged forward to grab my arm before I could retreat into the shadows of the balcony, but I stepped sideways, letting his hand grasp empty air. The red glow of the emergency torches outside washed over the lake palace walls, painting the room in deep crimson light as the royal courier shouted through the courtyard gates. High Steward Mailer and Archivist Morkant had taken control of the capital, backed by 300 heavily armed palace guards who believed the kings had lost their minds to a dark Omega curse. Caelan swore under his breath, drawing his broadsword completely from its sheath, the sharp steel ringing through the room. Rhyse stepped directly in front of me, his body positioning itself as a physical barrier between my chest and the open door, his rain and stones sent flaring into a wall of defense. Oren reached for his twin daggers, his jaw set in a hard line that replaced every trace of his usual playful smile. They were preparing to march directly into an ambush to protect me, believing Mailer wanted to execute the disgraced ex-fiancé to consolidate his power. I shoved Rhyse out of my way with a heavy push against his chest, walking past his frozen form to grab my coat off the back of the velvet chair. I told them to stop posing like tragical heroes and actually look at the military deployment outside the gates. My crown-weaving vision snapped open automatically, laying out the golden structural lines of the capital defense grid across my mind. Mailer had not just declared martial law. He had activated the ancient blood wards surrounding the imperial palace, locking the entire city in a magical dome. But the energy powering that dome was not coming from the royal treasury or the ancestral earth ley lines. The glowing energy lines bled directly from the central hall where Aster was currently resting under Morkant's care. Aster was not the mastermind behind my downfall. He was the battery. Morkant had systematically extracted 15 years of my childhood memories and forced them into Aster's mind, creating a fake identity that would force the Triplet kings to reject me. Once the true bond was broken, Morkant used the spiritual friction from our severed connection to charge the city's defense grid, turning Aster into a living siphon that would burn out his heart within 48 hours. The original Nico had not been executed for treason because he was hated. He had been framed and executed because his death would make the memory swap permanent, permanently binding the kings to a puppet they could control. Caelan stared at me as the realization slammed into his mind, his broadsword trembling slightly in his grip as the raw horror of his mistake broke through his pride. He had spent 3 years protecting Aster from Nico, believing he was shielding an innocent boy from a jealous villain, while actually helping a traitor drain the life out of both of them. Rhyse dropped his hands to his sides, his breath coming in ragged, short gasps as his legal mind reconstructed every trial, every signed order, and every ignored plea Nico had ever brought to his court. He had personally signed the banishment papers, believing he was enforcing justice, while sealing the doom of the boy who had once wrapped silk bandages around his bleeding knees in the garden. The heavy courtyard gates blew inward with a deafening roar, splintering into thousands of flying wooden shards as Morkant's elite enforcers poured into the estate. Their dark steel armor glittered under the red torchlight, their crossbows loaded with heavy iron bolts designed to pierce high-rank alpha hides. Morkant stepped through the smoke, dressed in his long purple archivist robes, holding a silver staff capped with a glowing purple crystal that pulsed with the stolen memories of 100 forgotten children. He looked at the 3 kings standing in front of me, let out a dry, cold laugh, and raised his staff to give the order to fire. I didn't wait for Caelan to swing his sword or for Rhyse to issue a command. I reached into my coat, pulled out the iron box containing the 3 rejected royal mating rings, and slammed it down onto the stone floor with all the strength in my arms. The metal shattered, scattering the glowing gold rings directly into the path of the incoming magical energy. My rain-soaked jasmine scent erupted into a roaring gale, locking onto the silver staff's frequency and reversing the flow of power in an instant. The glowing purple crystal violently exploded, showering the courtyard in blinding white sparks that tore through the enforcers' ranks like shrapnel. Morkant shrieked as the feedback blasted him backward into the mud, his dark robes catching fire as the stolen memory threads snapped free from his control. Ghostly, translucent images of the past exploded into the air, filling the courtyard with giant, floating projections of Morkant extracting memories from sleeping noble children, forging tax ledgers, and poisoning the western grain supply. The 300 palace guards standing outside the gates stopped their charge, staring up at the sky in absolute horror as their master's crimes played out in brilliant, undeniable light for the entire city to see. Oren leaped forward like a panther, his twin daggers flashing through the dark as he pinned Morkant to the mud by his shoulders before the traitor could cast another spell. Caelan turned toward me, his face pale, his golden eyes filled with an overwhelming, desperate plea for forgiveness as he took a slow step closer. He reached out his hand, his voice breaking as he whispered my real name for the very first time, begging me to let him make things right. Before his fingers could touch my coat, a shadow detached itself from the high stone wall above us, dropping silently behind Rhyse with a raised obsidian blade aimed directly at his exposed neck. Chapter 7. I grabbed Rhyse by his silk collar and yanked him backward with every ounce of strength in my body, sending us both sprawling across the damp cobblestones just as the black blade sliced through the empty air where his neck had been a second ago. High Steward Mailer landed on his feet like a venomous spider, his fine velvet robes replaced by light dragon-scale armor, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He did not care that his archivist was pinned in the mud or that his treason was currently projected across the night sky for the entire capital to see. He aimed a miniature hand crossbow straight at my chest, his finger pulling the trigger before Caelan or Oren could bridge the gap between us. The heavy iron bolt hissed through the dark air, aimed squarely at my heart. Caelan did not think, did not hesitate, and did not use his broadsword to block. He threw his massive body directly into the projectile's path, taking the dark iron tip deep into his shoulder. The impact forced a harsh, choked cry from his throat as he slammed into the stone floor beside me, his blood pooling against the wet ground, smelling sharply of copper and burnt cedar. Rhyse scrambled to his knees, his hands frantically pressing down on his brother's wound to stop the bleeding, his cold magistrate demeanor completely collapsing into sheer panic. He looked up at Mailer with eyes that burned like frozen steel, his alpha aura surging outward in a violent wave that shattered the glass windows of the lakeside palace behind us. Oren left Morkant in the mud, moving like a blur of gray light as he drove his daggers straight through Mailer's crossbow arm, pinning the traitor against the stone wall of the courtyard with a sickening crunch of bone. Mailer screamed, his black blade falling from his limp fingers as Oren leaned in close, his winter citrus scent turning toxic and heavy with lethal intent. Oren did not execute him on the spot. He pulled a set of heavy anti-magic iron cuffs from his belt and slammed them around Mailer's wrists, locking the High Steward's power away forever. The remaining royal guards outside the gates dropped their weapons to the cobblestones, falling to their knees in absolute surrender as the truth of the conspiracy sank in. I knelt beside Caelan, my hands covered in his hot blood as I reached for his collar to cut away the torn fabric around the wound. The dark iron bolt was coated in a black, bubbling poison designed to paralyze an alpha's internal energy core within minutes. Caelan looked up at me through blurred, pain-filled eyes, his hand trembling as he reached up to gently touch the edge of my sleeve, refusing to let the guards carry him away to the medical team. He whispered through cracked lips that he did not care about the poison or the throne, begging me to tell him that I would not leave the Empire once the dust settled. I looked him dead in the eye, pulled a small silver flask of strong spirit from my belt, and poured it directly onto his open wound without warning. Caelan hissed through his teeth, his grip on my sleeve tightening as the alcohol burned away the surface poison, but he never broke eye contact. I told him that taking a bullet for me did not erase 3 years of emotional neglect, and it certainly did not give him the right to guilt-trip me into staying. I informed him that if he survived the night, he was going to pay for every single piece of ruined furniture in my sunroom out of his personal war budget. Despite the agonizing pain, a weak, genuine smile broke across Caelan's face, his chest rising and falling in steady, heavy gasps as the poison's spread slowed down. Rhyse helped me lift him onto a wooden stretcher brought by the loyal palace medics, his eyes fixed on mine with a quiet, profound respect that held no remaining traces of his past arrogance. We marched back to the central capital at dawn, bringing the bound traitors before the assembled Grand Council of nobles, guild leaders, and common workers. The massive hall that had witnessed my public rejection 2 days ago was now filled with a stunned, silent crowd watching the 3 triplet kings stand before the throne without their crowns. Rhyse stepped forward, unrolling a grand imperial decree that completely abolished the old rank laws, restored the stolen pensions to the retired workers, and officially stripped the royal house of its absolute authority over the citizens. He turned toward where I stood near the back doors, holding out the gold-bound rejection contract that had started this entire nightmare. He took a quill, signed his name at the bottom with a firm, steady hand, and passed the pen to Oren, who added his signature without a moment's hesitation. Caelan, his shoulder wrapped in thick white bandages, stepped up last, placing his official seal over the parchment before sliding the document toward me across the marble floor. Rhyse announced to the entire court that the ancient bond was officially severed, declaring that I was a completely free citizen with no obligations to the crown, the lineage, or the three kings. He stated that if they ever wished to stand beside me again, it would not be through ancestral marks or forced contracts, but through earning my trust as equal human beings. The entire grand hall held its breath, waiting for my reaction as I walked down the center aisle toward the marble dais. I picked up the signed document, checked every single signature for legal loopholes, and folded it neatly into my coat pocket. I looked at the three identical alphas standing before me, their scents of cedar, rain, and citrus blending with my rain-soaked jasmine in a soft, balanced harmony that felt completely new. I told them that my first condition for even considering a single dinner date was an independent bedroom with a lock on the inside and one full day every week where nobody was allowed to mention the Empire. Oren laughed softly, stepping down from the dais to stand right in front of me, his eyes shining with a warmth that felt real and unburdened. He reached out his hand, asking if I would do them the honor of letting them walk me back to the lakeside palace as ordinary suitors. I took his hand, letting a small, rare smile show on my face as we turned toward the exit together. But as we stepped through the heavy oak doors into the morning sunlight, a young page rushed up to me with a frantic look on his face, handing me a small, sealed envelope that had been found inside my pillowcase at the lake house. I broke the wax seal, pulled out the single slip of parchment, and read the handwritten line that made my blood run cold. "You are not the first person from Chicago to wake up in this palace." Chapter 8. My fingers tightened around the heavy parchment, the rough paper crinkling under my grip as the morning sun hit the dark ink. The three words at the end of the sentence burned into my eyes like a hot iron, shattering the fragile sense of peace that had just settled over the courtyard. Caelan saw my face turn pale, his protective instincts flaring up instantly as he stepped closer, his broad shoulder pressing lightly against mine as he asked what was written on the note. I shoved the paper deep inside my coat pocket, forced a sharp, unbothered smirk onto my lips, and told him it was just a late catering bill from the berry cake supplier. We walked through the grand gates of the capital together, leaving behind the cheering crowds, the dismantled court hierarchies, and the broken legal systems that had held this empire in a stranglehold for centuries. The journey back to the lakeside palace was quiet, filled only with the rhythmic sound of horse hooves against the dirt road and the crisp morning breeze blowing across the water. For the first time in 2 lives, nobody was chasing me with a debt, nobody was demanding my total sacrifice, and nobody was treating my existence as a political tool. When we reached the lake house, I did not head for the grand throne room or the official guest suites. I went straight to the sunroom, threw open the high glass doors to let the fresh lake air flood the dusty room, and sank into my favorite velvet chaise lounge with a heavy, contented sigh. Caelan, Rhyse, and Oren followed me inside, but they did not take the high seats or command the space like sovereign rulers. Caelan sat quietly on the wooden floor near the door, resting his injured shoulder against the frame, while Rhyse pulled up a simple wooden stool to review the new civil pension logs. Oren walked over to the small kitchen nook, carefully brewing a pot of fresh herbal tea without asking a single servant for help. They had stopped trying to possess my space, my time, or my choices. They were learning that real love was not built on high titles, ancient bond marks, or absolute dominance. It was built on patience, quiet accountability, and the basic respect for another person's freedom. Oren brought me a warm ceramic cup, sitting down on the edge of the floor near my feet, his winter citrus scent calm, sweet, and completely free of the toxic anxiety that had driven him for years. He looked up at me with an open, honest expression, noting that I had not taken a single nap since the trial ended, and suggested that I finally get some rest. I took a slow sip of the tea, tasting the sweet honey and crisp mint, and admitted that for the first time in 26 years, my mind felt quiet enough to actually dream without seeing financial spreadsheets or magical warning lines. Rhyse set his ledger down on the table, looking across the room at his two brothers before fixing his calm blue eyes on mine. He said that the real villain of our story was never just a corrupt archivist or a greedy steward. The real villain was a toxic culture that taught people to treat others as objects to be owned, used, and discarded whenever convenient. He promised that as long as he held a voice in the new government, no Omega, Beta, or Alpha in this land would ever be forced into a bond against their will or punished for standing up for their personal dignity. I leaned my head back against the velvet cushion, closing my eyes as the warm sunlight washed over my face, feeling the heavy burden of 2 long lives finally lift off my shoulders. Forgiveness was not something you gave away instantly because someone said they were sorry. It was a slow, daily practice that required real, permanent change in how people treated each other. The Triplet Kings had a long way to go before I would ever let them put a permanent mark on my skin again, but for the first time they were actually doing the hard work to earn it. I looked directly into the camera of my own mind, thinking of every person out there who had ever felt trapped by family expectations, bad relationships, or toxic work environments that demanded endless sacrifice for zero respect. You do not have to stay in a story that treats you like an option. You have the power to sign your own rejection contract, step out of the hall, and demand the peace you truly deserve. As the sun set over the quiet waters of the lake, painting the sky in deep shades of gold, purple, and soft pink, I wrapped my wool blanket tighter around my shoulders and finally let myself fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Chapter 9. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon before the paper in my pocket began to burn with a steady, prickling heat against my ribs. I pulled the small slip of parchment out from under my coat, watching as the handwritten ink shifted and liquefied on the page, dissolving the message about Chicago into glowing, golden coordinates. Caelan noticed the sharp shift in my rain-soaked jasmine scent before I even moved a muscle, his broad shoulders straightening instantly as he stepped away from the doorframe. Rhyse set his feather pen down on his ledger with a soft tap, his cold blue eyes locking onto the glowing paper in my hands, while Oren abandoned the tea kettle to stand right beside my chair. The energy humming off the note was not royal magic, nor was it tied to the ancestral land of Asterwin. It was a dense, structured frequency that matched the exact geometric pattern of my crown weaving. I stood up from the velvet chaise, told all 3 alphas to stay behind, and walked straight out into the courtyard toward the ancient bell tower at the edge of the lake estate. Caelan grabbed his cloak and fell into step on my right, his hand resting on the hilt of his broadsword, while Rhyse and Oren flanked my left without uttering a single word of protest. They had learned not to order me around, but they were certainly not letting me march into a strange magical anomaly alone. The heavy wooden door at the base of the bell tower was covered in thick ivy and sealed with an ancient, rusted iron padlock that had not been opened in at least 2 centuries. I reached out, brushing my bare fingers against the cold iron of the lock, letting my crown-weaving vision strip away the physical surface of the metal. A massive, glowing golden grid expanded in my mind, revealing an intricate digital lock construct, a binary security cipher designed using modern computer programming logic from my previous life on Earth. The original creator of this palace had not used ancient runes or blood sacrifices. They had built a mechanical firewall using base 2 code translated into physical gears. My heart hammered against my chest as I tapped the iron surface 4 times in a precise, rhythmic sequence, inputting the universal override command I used to use on corporate servers in downtown Chicago. The rusted lock clicked open with a heavy metallic snap, the ancient hinges groaning as the heavy oak door swung inward to reveal a spiral stone staircase leading down into the dark earth. Cold, dry air rushed up from the subterranean chamber, carrying a sharp, artificial smell that smelled distinctly of ozone, copper wire, and air-conditioned office space rather than damp stone. Oren pulled a small glass lantern from his belt, casting long shadows across the walls as we descended into the hidden vault beneath the lake. At the bottom of the stairs sat a clean, polished white room made of reinforced concrete, completely untouched by the damp soil of the Veyrion Empire. In the center of the room stood a massive steel desk holding a heavy, glass-screened monitor connected to a humming bronze generator, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. Sitting on the leather office chair was a leather-bound journal bearing a gold-embossed logo that made my jaw drop, the exact corporate emblem of the financial firm where I had worked myself to death 6 minutes before transmigrating. Rhyse stepped forward, his eyes scanning the smooth, artificial walls and the strange glass machinery with absolute bewilderment, asking in a low whisper what kind of ancient sorcery had built such a place. I walked over to the desk, blew the thick dust off the journal's cover, and opened it to the very first page, recognizing the sharp, cursive handwriting immediately. The journal belonged to Arthur Vance, the founder of my former accounting firm, who had mysteriously vanished from his Chicago high-rise 30 years ago without leaving a single trace. Arthur had transmigrated into this exact world as an Omega, built the Veyrion legal system, designed the original bond contracts to protect low-rank Omegas from alpha tyranny, and hidden this sanctuary before his death. On the final page of his journal, Arthur had written a warning. The crown-weaving power was not a random genetic gift, but an artificial system designed to balance power between ranks whenever an empire turned corrupt. The note warned that if the 3 Alpha Kings ever failed to respect an Omega's free will, the crown-weaving network would systematically dismantle their royal authority piece by piece. I turned around to face Caelan, Rhyse, and Oren, showing them the written words left behind by a man who had walked in my shoes decades ago. Caelan looked at the glowing glass screen, then looked at me, his golden eyes filled with a heavy, solemn understanding as he dropped to one knee before the steel desk. He swore on his honor, his blood, and his life that he would never again allow any system or law to reduce a person to a puppet or a prize. Before I could answer, the glass screen on the desk suddenly flashed to life with a loud, high-pitched electronic chime, illuminating the dark concrete room in bright blue light. A new line of red text began typing itself across the monitor screen, displaying a live security feed from the northern border of the Veyrion Empire. A massive, dark war fleet bearing the crest of a foreign alpha nation was currently crossing the mountain pass toward our undefended borders. Chapter 10. The red flashing text on the screen cast long, ominous shadows across the concrete vault as the 3 kings stared at the live military feed in absolute shock. Foreign Emperor Malachor had used the political chaos created by Morkant's exposure to launch a surprise invasion, marching 40,000 heavily armed troops toward our northern mountain pass while our imperial armies were still recovering. Caelan's military mind kicked in instantly, his jaw tightening as he analyzed the enemy troop formations displaying across the glass monitor, quickly calculating that our northern outposts would fall within 6 hours if no orders were issued. Rhyse reached for his ledger to calculate supply lines, but I stepped in front of the screen, raising my hand to cut off their rising panic. I pulled Arthur's journal toward me, flipped to the back index, and located the master schematic for the Imperial Defense Network that connected directly to the capital grid. Arthur had built a hidden failsafe into the geography of the Veyrion Mountain Pass, a series of localized acoustic landmines powered by natural atmospheric energy that could be triggered directly from this desk. I tapped the glowing glass screen, using my crown-weaving vision to map the golden energy lines running from the vault straight through the subterranean earth toward the northern border. I turned to Caelan and told him to ride to the northern garrison with his vanguard, not to engage in a bloody frontal battle, but to herd Malachor's marching army directly into the narrow stone canyon known as the Serpent's Throat. Caelan looked at me with deep trust, nodding his head without a single second of hesitation or doubt, pulling his cloak tightly around his shoulders as he turned to carry out the plan. Rhyse and Oren moved to coordinate the civilian evacuation orders and secure the capital city, leaving me alone in the high-tech vault to operate the master control system. 3 hours later, the communication screen flashed green as Caelan's signal flared from the northern front. Sitting at the steel desk 300 miles away, I watched through the live energy grid as Emperor Malachor's massive war fleet marched straight into the narrow canyon, confident in their easy victory over a divided empire. I placed my bare palm over the vault's central glass terminal, sending a precise, pulsing surge of crown-weaving energy straight through the earth ley lines. A localized seismic shockwave detonated inside the Serpent's Throat, triggering a massive, controlled rockslide that sealed both ends of the canyon without killing a single foreign soldier, completely trapping Malakur's entire army inside the stone walls. The foreign emperor surrendered his weapons within 20 minutes, realizing his entire grand invasion had been dismantled by an unseen force without a single drop of royal blood being spilled on the battlefield. By the next afternoon, peace had returned to the Veyrion Empire, stronger, cleaner, and more resilient than it had ever been in its long history. The Grand Royal Plaza in the capital was packed with thousands of citizens gathered not for an imperial coronation or a forced mating ceremony, but to celebrate the formal signing of the new imperial constitution. The new laws guaranteed equal rights, fair wages, healthcare, and absolute personal freedom for every citizen, regardless of whether they were born in Alpha, Beta, or Omega. I stood on the high marble balcony overlooking the cheering crowds, dressed in a simple, elegant dark tunic, holding the official document that permanently stripped the throne of its absolute power. Caelan, Rhyse, and Oren stood beside me, wearing simple formal coats without their golden crowns, their scents of cedar smoke, cold rain, and winter citrus blending harmoniously with my rain-soaked jasmine. They did not try to stand in front of me or speak on my behalf. They stood beside me as true partners who had earned their place through genuine respect, humility, and shared sacrifice. When the high priest stepped forward with the ceremonial velvet cushion and instructed me to kneel before the throne to receive the Civil Medal of Honor, I looked at him with a sassy, unbothered smirk, crossed my arms over my chest, and told him that I had negotiated the absolute right to sit down whenever my feet got tired. The entire courtyard erupted into a roaring wave of warm laughter, with Caelan, Rhyse, and Oren laughing louder than anyone else in the assembly as a soft chair was immediately brought out for me. That evening, as the purple twilight settled over the tranquil waters of the lakeside palace, the four of us sat together on the open balcony, sharing a simple meal and talking about the future without a single mention of state politics or royal obligations. I leaned back against the plush cushions, sipping a hot cup of mint tea, feeling the quiet, earned peace that had finally replaced the exhaustion of 2 long lives. I looked directly into the camera of your heart, my voice echoing with the absolute truth of everything I had learned through heartbreak, betrayal, and rebirth. You are the sole author of your own life story, and no matter how heavy your past debts or scars might feel today, you always have the power to walk away from people who do not value your worth. If Tavion's journey inspired you, touched your soul, or reminded you of your own inner strength today, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss another empowering BL narrative on our channel. Your incredible support allows us to bring you deeply emotional, life-changing stories that uplift, heal, and inspire your heart every single week. Leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts on Tavion's final choice. Your story might be the exact light someone else needs to see in the dark. The end.